All right. You ready to do it?
I'm ready.
Okay, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have with my guest today, Dr. Brian Tierney. Brian, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you,
You're
Guy.
welcome.
Good to be here.
Awesome. So Dr. Tierney is a somatic psychologist in private practice in San Jose, California. He's an adjunct professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where he teaches neuroscience to somatic students. Brian has taught the neuroscience of trauma resolution for a decade now and is working on publishing his first book after his dissertation, which includes his own unique approach to trauma resolution, hands-on therapy, and social artistry that he's calling Visionary Somatics. Brian, welcome to the podcast. Before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently, and then we'll dive in.
I'm from St. Paul, Minnesota, originally, and currently hail from San Jose, California.
Okay. All right. So you have very interesting background, eclectic to a certain degree, integrative, of course. How did you get into this field?
Well, really, it was through my own suffering. You know, I was doing a bachelor's in marketing, and I started feeling miserable and just socially anxious, and I didn't realize that I was traumatized by my upbringing, traumatized by secrecy, I guess you could say. That kind of, yeah. So just really just my waking up process to my, through my own suffering.
And what did that suffering look like, if I can ask you that question?
Well, it was this sensation that I had in my throat. And that kind of got amplified by social anxiety. So right from the beginning, I was already starting to have this instinct and this intuition about the connection between psyche and soma, between mind and body, because I knew when I went to the medical doctors that there was something psychogenic about it, that there was something psychological about it, so that then when they were saying, oh, you got something wrong with your gut, you have the gastroesophageal reflux or something, part of my philosophical self or my deep self knew that wasn't all of it, because I knew I could feel that there was a social component, that there was an anxiety component, and I just knew that it was psychogenic. I knew it had psychological elements. So that really got me going towards, the healing arts and massage therapy, craniosacral therapy, and men's work, and all of this eclectic stuff that I've been up to for quite some time.
So when you realized or began to realize that there was this connection between psyche and soma, and that your upbringing had played a role in this, how old were you at that point?
Yeah, I was 20.
Okay.
I was 20.
Now, what did the suffering look like up until that point? How was it manifesting for you?
Well, I think that it was, I had unexpressed, well, I think it was kind of like a trauma regarding the Christian church. I was just talking to a colleague the other day about being publicly shamed by a pastor for kissing my girlfriend when I was 16. And so, and I didn't realize how deeply that had shaped me until many years later, actually, when I had already moved to California and started to do body work and to do massage. I hadn't realized that my body was so ashamed of itself, so ashamed of pleasure, so ashamed of the desires that are circulating through this body. I didn't even know that was there. And then so through backward engineering, I was able to and through some therapy, I was able to kind of go, oh, gosh, I'm so repressed. And that's kind of where it came from, is through some of these ideas that feel so against the body and its desires and so on. And that was starting to kind of emerge in my 20s and erupt in my 20s, but I didn't have a language for it. And I think that's one of the reasons why it constellated in the throat, right?
Interesting.
Because I didn't have a language for it. I didn't know how to express why I was suffering. It just like showed up right here, right? And it was
Yeah.
like a cork was stuck in there and I didn't know how to pop it out.
So things evolved. You did your undergrad, uh, and did you focus on psychology or what?
No, the undergrad was marketing. My first
Okay.
job out of school was marketing director for a healing arts school, a residential healing arts school in Northern California. That was my way out of the Midwest. And that's when I got introduced to all these really eclectic and interesting healers coming from more scientific neurological approaches to, craniosacral therapy, like the kind of more woo-woo stuff like polarity therapy, more classical anatomical massage. So all these different approaches, all these different approaches.
So you decided to pursue a graduate degree.
Mhm.
And what was the impetus for that? What were you thinking when you went in? I'm going to study this. I want to study this or focus on this, etc.
Yeah. So it was a long time later that I went to graduate school. I was a massage therapist and a craniosacral therapist for many years. So at Harwood Institute, which is where I lived, up on the hill as a marketing director, and it's all these different traveling teachers and all that. People were doing trauma resolution work, just they didn't really have that frame for it, but that work was being done, right, through the body work approaches.
Mm-hmm.
And it was somatic psychological, so it had a somatic psychology to it, and it was kind of framed in that way. So modalities were taught, techniques were taught, but it wasn't necessarily. It didn't in the beginning. It didn't make me go, "Oh, I want to get a psychology degree."
Mm-hmm.
I didn't make that connection. I want to be a body worker specializing in trauma resolution, and I want to develop a skill set for that. But it wasn't until many years later that I was like, I want to get my doctorate. After a long journey of being a body worker and teaching body work and teaching craniosacral therapy, which has a trauma resolution branch. In fact, it's kind of the core of some of the craniosacral teachings. It's like a somatic experiencing training. It's kind of like one branch of craniosacral work, or a couple branches of it, are like their own brand of somatic experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So I kind of taught that brand, or a couple different brands of trauma resolution, through the craniosacral community for years. And then, like somewhere in there, I was like, you know what? I just really love psychology, and I want to get licensed. And that's when I went to graduate school.
Okay. Now, I mean, as we talked about in the bio, I mean, you do a lot of different things. So
Yeah.
when you talk to people, what's your thumbnail sketch of what you do? And I guess behind that, what is your passion in this, or your mission in the work you do?
Yeah. Well, one of course, the unique things about me is that I'm a hands-on therapist. So, like, I've taught neuroanatomy and the anatomy of the nervous system for many years in the context of being a body worker. So I touch people. When I do trauma resolution work, not all the time, I'm trained in EMDR and all that stuff, but I'm often touching the body. Okay, so my hands are in a direct interface with the body as we're talking about things. I can tell you more about the model in Visionary Somatics and some of the neuroscience if we have time to get there. But the fundamental thing, right, and my niche is that I touch people. So
Yep.
I, do an intake interview. We talk, I get a history and so on. But then pretty soon we're on the table and my hands are in a direct interface with the nervous system while we continue to explore. Sometimes I'll have those tappers on the feet, so that we're doing some of the EMDR work, but on the table with me touching them.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, so walk us through, for example, someone comes to you, give us kind of an idea of how you would work with them.
Yeah. Heavily contextual, but let's pluck an example where, somebody with complex trauma. So it isn't just a one-off. As the literature says, and consistent with what shows up in my practice, the one-off sorts of traumas are easier to work with clinically. There's less complexity from a body worker's perspective and from a psychologist's perspective. Like a one-time physical accident, like a car accident, is fairly easily cleared through some resequencing work and things like that. And so it's the complex trauma cases that are complex and take quite some time. So I'll pick a complex trauma case to orient to. And this person had a car accident, but this is at the end of a very large set of already existing traumas, sexual abuse, physical abuse, all sorts of marginalization happening because they're an ethnicity that's non-white and so on. So racialized trauma. So all of those factors are at play with this person. And then at the end of this sequence of horrible traumas, you have a really bad car accident where they were brought to a hospital and basically racially abused.
Oh my God.
At the hospital and put in a psychiatric ward, not because there was an objective reality behind the clinicians that put them there, but because of some racialized distortions. And so basically just a horrible situation, right? Just, physical trauma plus all this other
like a worst case scenario, pretty much.
Worst case scenario.
Okay.
So really, as is the case with a lot of complex traumas, the whole first phase is just about helping that person to stabilize. Because as soon as we would even approach anything that was the content of her trauma, her nervous system would be off to the races. So, and because she has that sexual trauma history, there's no way that we're going to do touch. Because I could tell right from the beginning that approaching, even if it was slow and respectful, that her nervous system would just ramp up and then she would go into very quick speaking, and just basically dissociate. And go into her headache pattern, which is one of the salient features of her symptoms, is horrible headaches. So really it was just, in the beginning phases, just teaching her tools to self-regulate, which I think is a classic part of our modern day skill set, right? Just, some visualization techniques, some breathing techniques to slow things down. And then what I found interestingly is this is where the talk therapy portion was really necessary in the beginning, where this is where I'm like, I'm so glad I'm a talk therapist too, and not just a body worker or whatever, because some meaning making frames were super essential at this point. That if it was just EMDR, or if it was just body work or something, these sorts of healing contexts that were in the framing of the therapy itself wouldn't have happened. And I find that they were essential. Like, so framing about how, she needs to move from caregiving others and having others be the center of her universe to actually moving to take care of herself. She has a special needs brother that she is constantly taking care of and displacing her needs onto. So like providing a context for her was essential. Like, this is about you. Therapy is about you, and it's time for you to start moving away from putting all of your attention and care elsewhere, and it's time for you to move it towards yourself here. And actually the whole family was involved in framing it that way. So, and this was a pivotal moment in the framing of the therapy and in the kind of creation of the therapeutic alliance that then set the tone for doing processing work with the EMDR. But we're still at this stage, even after a year in, we're still not at a place where this is a client I wouldn't touch yet.
Okay.
We're still
Okay.
not there. Yeah,
Okay.
yet.
Okay. So I want to get to the point, Brian, where you are working with your touch, and talk specifically about what modality, what type of body work are you using when you're working with someone who's experienced trauma? What does that look like?
Yeah, I have a whole range. So I go from the really, really neutral, non-movement touch forms like craniosacral therapy, where it's pure work with the nervous system. And so it's stillness touch. There's no movement. And it's providing a place of coherence through the stillness, providing stillness, and it's really stabilizing. Craniosacral touch is super stabilizing. Have you ever had craniosacral? No.
No.
Super stabilizing. It's like it's like a shared meditation in a way. So like the hand just becomes this kind of place of orientation for the body and for the nervous system. It's just stillness. So that's one, like a neutral, non-stimulating. It's not adding anything to the nervous system, and that's quite good for traumatized bodies, right? Because if you start, it's already added to so much that you don't need to add anymore. But there's some cases where I'm doing more deep tissue stuff, where it really feels like the trauma is in the musculoskeletal system. So, and the reason why I'm gesturing at my neck is because of how deep the trauma gets into the orienting reflex, which is in the neck, right? And how loaded these neck muscles can get.
Wow.
And so I'll get in there and start to kind of gently but deeply iron out the musculoskeletal stuff in there. And then the third component is more of I guess I would call it like a distraction technique, therapeutic distraction, which is kind of like shaking the body, taking limbs and kind of shaking them and moving them like this. And what that does is that gives me a sense of some of the neurological holding patterns. So the third one is more of a movement approach. Wow. Passive movement approach, where I'm unwinding locating and unwinding neurological patterns through movement.
It's really fascinating to me to hear you talk about this. I haven't spoken with too many people who work directly with touch relative to trauma. And it seems really interesting and fascinating. And when you're touching someone, and I love the way you described your progression in a sense, to stabilizing, you're not even moving in the beginning. When you do start to move, or when you even place your hands, that's in response to what? Your intuition, a combination of what the person is saying or feeling, or what?
It's intuition, it's consent. There is a very distinct spatial shift often, right? Because we're moving from being both vertical and talking to being on the table. So that spatial shift is part of the whole thing.
Mm.
So, and what's informing that, yeah, is intuition. For example, this case, my intuition based on feedback but also just my gut is this person isn't going to lay on the table for probably another year. So that would be 2 years in. Whereas other people, that's what they like about my history, and they're coming in for that, and 15 minutes in, we're on the table. You know what I mean? So it's definitely an intuition thing. It's a consent thing. It's a negotiation thing.
Now, with the obvious caveat that everyone's different, right? All situations are different to a certain degree. There's the common understanding that trauma resides in the body, of course, and you have other modalities, SPI, SCI, that work with the body. Not always hands-on, though. How would you kind of distinguish those modalities from what you do, and the effectiveness and so forth?
Well, let's take somatic experiencing. How about that? You're trained in somatic experiencing, yeah? Or
No, I
no?
studied sensory motor psychotherapy.
Oh, yeah, Pat
Yeah,
Ogden.
yeah.
So I was trained as a role for like Pat as well. So I have that, and that's one of the things I love about Pat. She was a role for, yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I know she was into dance. She's amazing, that woman.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so yeah, I think I'll take the example of somatic experiencing. Just because I did a lot of foundational work in my neuroscience course, kind of transposing some of my ideas with the somatic experience. So that's what's most available to me at the moment. So I would say that in practice, it's the neuroscience, how the knowledge of the neuroscience informs my touch practice. And there's considerable overlap in my practice with somatic experiencing in that in how I operationalize the neurological sciences. Okay.
Mhm.
So and it orbits around the central issue of sequencing, how the brain does sequencing, and that trauma is a sequence, right? That is it, and that there's a neurology to sequencing, and that there is a clinical skill set that's developed over time, and us in the different camps of trauma resolution basically are different camps of resequencing, different brands and approaches to resequencing. But to me, in my books, the core of it is neurological resequencing. And then we just have our brands and tribes and languages for how that, and clinical tools that some of them cut across different tribes, some of them don't. But to me, the fundamental is how the brain does sequencing.
Now, for define sequencing for our listeners.
So sequencing is, reality comes to us in fragments. So like for example, the visual information comes in super fragmented and in like a scatter plot of time and space. And that information needs to be sequenced and put in a temporal order, in a time order, and in a spatial order that puts it all in a kind of coherent flow, in a sequence, right? And the organ that does that in the brain is the cerebellum. Okay. The cerebellum is the master sequencer in the brain. And so, like, for example, the latest research about the efficacy of EMDR is that it's basically all about the cerebellum. So it's like cerebellum. Cerebellum governs fine motor skills. So, essentially, like what happens in trauma, just to kind of reduce the complexity and put it into the framework of sequencing, is that trauma is a fragmentation process, okay? And that the normal flow of sequenced reality, what we're used to, and this gets into default mode network stuff. I don't know if we want to get into that, but we have a kind of sequence that predicts and projects our reality over and over again. It's kind of like our daily hallucination, right? That's the default mode network. And that's our day-to-day sequenced reality that we keep on projecting, and it's habitual and it just keeps on going. But trauma fragments that, it breaks it up. And it puts a big break in the flow of sequencing. And
Hence
so then,
resequencing.
yep. So then,
Yeah.
hence resequencing, getting structure back into the flow of perception. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. So as we kind of wind down here, again, we're speaking with Dr. Brian Tierney. Your website here is somaticdoctor.com. Who do you work with? Who's in your kind of wheelhouse, as it were?
Yeah, I work with all traumatized bodies. I used to even work with infants. I work a little bit less with children now,
Okay.
and focus mainly on people about 10 years old and older, people that are interested in embodied approaches, that want to get the body moving, and people interested in touch. And I work with couples, and yeah, and people interested in the expressive arts too. It's something I didn't talk about in our talk here, but I also use the arts a bit,
Mm-hmm.
expressive arts and so on.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
kind of intrigued me about you and your bio. It's very kind of eclectic and rich. You know, speaking with you, Brian, reminds me of a interview I did a while ago with a gentleman who's since deceased. His name is Jerry Vest. And when I interviewed him, he was an older guy, and he worked with veterans.
Mhm.
And he said, you know, when I asked him about the challenges of being a male and working with touch, he said, how how can you not work in this field of trauma without touching, without like communicating and joining in a sense? And it was so kind of refreshing and surprising at the same time to hear this kind of grizzly guy who works with veterans talk about like touching other veterans, healing them. These guys had been just jacked up, traumatized. So that's kind of an entryway to ask you, as a male therapist working with touch. I'm assuming there have been some challenges even getting into this. How was that flowed for you? How have you worked with that? And is it an issue?
You know, I just got the chills with you sharing this story about this guy, just this grizzly old guy. I love that. I just wanted to say that first. But no, it actually hasn't been a huge issue. People, it's, I don't know. It just feels like it's intuitive, just like you
Mm-hmm.
meant. It's like, why not? And
Right.
yeah, there can be situations where it's like there is a sense where touch is too much too fast, but somehow that just seems to always get communicated. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
there's this kind of story that people are going to dissociate and not have access to their no. But to
Mm-hmm.
me, as a practitioner that's been in this work for so long, I pick that up right away. I mean, sometimes later on downstream, I might have somebody say, that was a bit too fast for me. And then I'll go, oh yeah, that signal that I had when we made first contact was correct. And it helps me to fine tune that moment of contact. But usually there's really obvious messages coming from the body or from the person that is informing, okay, is it a go or is it not a go?
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. So how do people contact you, Brian? What's the best way?
Yeah, through the website, there's a consultation button you can click on. That's somaticdoctor.com. I produce some cool content on my Instagram, which is the Somatic Doctor. And then consistent with all that is my Gmail, which is somaticdoctor@gmail.com. Feel free to. I have a trauma paper that I like to share and stuff like that. That's kind of cool. Oh, by the way, that you were asking for favorite books. Have you heard of this one, Trauma Tragedy Therapy by Stephen Levine? Have you heard of this one?
By Stephen Levine.
Stephen Levine, not Peter Levine. Stephen.
Trauma
Tragedy Therapy.
Tragedy Therapy. No.
It's brilliant, Guy. I would actually be super happy to come back on the podcast and chat it up about this one, because I think it's a really important one.
All right. Well, we'll do a follow-up. I was going to say, I'd love to have you back. Yeah.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, look, it's awesome talking to you. Super inspiring. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing what you're doing.
Thanks a lot, Guy. Good to meet you. Yeah.
All right. Likewise. We'll
Take
be in
care.
touch.
Yep. All right. Yep. Bye-bye.